What's up, y'all? Zavi D of Organic Health Movement coming to present a little video about a wonderful stretch that I'd love to share today called the 90-90 hip stretch. I've implemented this into my pre-exercise routine and I found it to be very useful for priming my external hip rotators to properly stabilize and also to help integrate the movement of the kinetic chain from the feet up through the crown of the head, as we must dissipate force in any movement from the feet through the crown of the head. Now, having proper activation of the external hip rotators is very helpful for stabilizing the femur. It's also very helpful for stabilizing the patella. And as flies fly into my face, I'll explain a little bit more about that. Many ankle inversion sprains, as well as medial tracking of the patella, which puts excess stress on the anterior cruciate ligament, also known as the ACL, is a result of weak external hip rotators. Now, due to a lot of sitting, we also have, coupled with weak external hip rotators, a lot of tight hip flexors. That would be the psoas, the rectus femoris, other muscles in the thigh and lumbopelvic hip region that tilt the pelvis forward. So my goal here today is to show you a nice stretch for getting into the IT band in a functional and corrective way using contract and relax stretching so that you don't put the muscle in a compromised state by stretching it for too long a period of time. What that means is that typically we're taught to stretch our hamstrings, for example, by leaning forward and hanging out here for a long time. Now, most of us don't need to be stretching our hamstrings to begin with, and that's another story. But I'd also like to point out that by hanging out here for a long time, we actually put the muscle in a compromised position because we're sending a signal to the nervous system that this muscle is too long. When we go to fire that muscle using the motor engrams or pathways of activation that are stored in our brain for different movement patterns, unfortunately what comes back is a mixed signal. So from the sensory neurons going into the central nervous system, we get a faulty message of this muscle is too long. And from the brain back to the muscle, we get a signal of this muscle needs to tighten up. You can see this quite frequently in a sprinter who does not know how to properly stretch and is in a 100-meter dash. They'll start off the line in about 10 to 15 yards through their event. They pull a hamstring and you see them limping down the line. That is the result of poor stretching techniques. And what I'm here today to present is a way to stretch the external hip rotators in a corrective and functional manner. Another side note, this stretch is very similar to what you'll find in yoga, called the pigeon pose. However, I'll explain a little bit about how the lumbar spine works with external hip rotators to give you a better sense of why we do this pose or why we do this stretch with 90 degrees in each knee. Now, let's go for the stretch. So, as the name implies, this is a stretch where we have 90 degrees from our back shin to our left thigh. Let's just say in this scenario of stretching with this right leg forward. So the first thing that I'll do is try to find proper alignment here in this left knee. Already I'm feeling this in my internal hip rotators of the left thigh, of the left side of the hip, I should say, as well as starting to find a little bit more movement of the pelvis forward. Now, typically we have a scenario where when we bend forward to stretch hip rotators, we round the lumbar spine. We actually end up stretching out the ligaments of the lumbar spine in this scenario rather than properly stretching the muscles that we're trying to get into. What that means for me is that as I approach this stretch, keeping a nice 90 degree in the front knee from the front right shin into the right thigh, as well as the left shin into the left thigh, I'm going to focus on keeping the chest tall. When I keep the chest tall, I'm able to properly align the hips so that when I do in fact lean forward, I'm able to push my butt back in space while keeping this nice alignment, 90-90, also from the right thigh to the left thigh. And I can lean forward in a way that doesn't stretch out the ligaments of the lumbar spine, but indeed goes right for that right IT band external hip rotator. Next, I place my left palm on the left thigh as a means of stabilizing the torso the rib cage and the shoulder girdle in a way that allows me to move directly from the hips, pushing back in space. Next, I turn to face my belly button towards the right inner thigh. This gives me more pull of the internal hip rotators that I'm stretching in the left leg, and allows me to get better alignment with this right femur bone, allowing me to go deeper into the stretch without compromising the sacroiliac joint of the right side of the pelvis. As I find this good alignment, I keep my chin and head up and think about pushing my butt back in space. Now, if you have tight hip flexors, you might experience this right knee wanting to lift when you push the butt back. The goal here is to make sure that you're pushing this right knee down into the mat, into the floor. After finding this nice alignment, pushing the butt back in space, I take a nice diaphragmatic inhale into the belly and begin my stretch by lowering my chest down about to an imaginary point, a foot in front of my right knee. Keeping the arch in the lumbar spine so that we're not rounding, which is very important for anybody with a lumbar herniation, as this flexion movement can push the disc back out of alignment, because typically lumbar herniations are posterior, meaning the vertebra in the lumbar spine are pinching in the front, pushing the disc out. So if you go into a flexion movement, it might feel good, but you actually further compromise the lumbar spine, potentially compressing a nerve root, which is not what we want. Keeping this nice arch in the lumbar spine, chest tall. I begin to lean forward, tracking the sternalis, which is a muscle right near the sternum, right over my right femur bone. Exhaling. When I find a nice stretch, I'll stop, keeping the arch in the lumbar spine. And now to contract, I'll push this right knee directly into the mat and the floor as a means of engaging those hip rotators, as a means of engaging the glutes, while keeping the arch in the lumbar spine, chest tall. Pushing down, 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 and then I'll exhale. Deeper into the stretch. Now, with any sort of contraction or movement out of the fetal position, so here, out, we inhale as a means of training the nervous system to move with the muscles. If you happen to exhale in this type of supination or external rotation position, you confuse the nervous system. So when we push our right knee down into the floor, pushing down here, pushing the shin into the floor, we want to make sure we inhale first. And I get a really beautiful stretch on the right outer hip here. And for me, somebody with tight hip flexors and a tight IT band, this stretch is really wonderful. My last little point as I'm being swarmed with ants and flies is to point out why pigeon pose can be often compromising to those with poor sacroiliac joint mechanics. Pigeon pose is actually quite a difficult variation of the 90-90 hip stretch. If you don't have proper alignment of the pelvis here, what happens is you start to push the right side of the pelvis into the hip flexor, into the psoas. And that can cause excess stress in that muscle that's already very tight. Now typically, because people can't go very far in the pose and in the context of a yoga class, they want to keep up with everyone else, they'll begin to round the spine and put this entire lumbopelvic hip complex in a compromised position. Already I can feel this starting to strain my hamstring, and I'm also getting an uncomfortable stretch of the right hip flexor. So instead, if you were to do pigeon pose, we only go down so far as we can keep alignment of the lumbar spine. About here for me, and I practice yoga quite a bit. So, right there is about where I feel it, and I don't get nearly as much stretch of the external left hip rotator as I would in the 90-90 hip stretch. So that's just a little video that I wanted to share with you all about the efficacy and the benefit of the 90-90 hip stretch. It's a wonderful tool, a wonderful stretch that I implement frequently. If done safely, it can benefit you tremendously if you have what's called a lower cross syndrome or tight hip flexors. And if you do happen to have any sort of lumbar issue, herniation, disc desiccation, I recommend finding a skilled physical therapist or check practitioner to tape your lumbar spine as a means of ensuring that you keep that nice arch as you stretch forward. Other than that, this has been Zavi D, owner of Organic Health Movement, team member at Awaken New Mexico, bringing you a quick video on the 90-90 hip stretch, hoping it will benefit you, bring you more love and peace in your practice, and allow you to get deeper into some tight muscles that are typically hard to stretch. In that spirit, namaste, have a beautiful day.